This is a story called The History of Bramley, Part 2, Yards and Yards of Bramley, by Bramley History Society. Townend Yard. During the middle of the 30s, I came to live in Townend Yard, and at first I hated it. My younger brother and sister came with our parents, but me and my older sister lived with our auntie in the beautiful county of Deeside in Scotland. The house we lived in Townend Yard was 3 stories high. The top story had once been a leather factory, so we had quite a few rats and mice. Our kitchen floor was made of flagstones. It was very uneven and it was often wet, and there would be water seeping through. There was plenty of pegged rugs down, and everyone had to take turns pegging a few clips. At Christmas, we always got a new rug. We used gas mantles downstairs and candles upstairs. A favourite trick that my brother would play on us would be to wait until we were halfway up the stairs, blow out the candles, and to frighten us by making noises. However, one day he got a fright because when he put his boot on, there was a mouse in it. To go to the toilet, we had to go across the road because that's where our toilet was. During the winter, we all had to dig our way over there, and we had to take a bucket with us because it would most likely be frozen. We would warm ourselves up by tearing up newspapers into squares, and then we would thread it on a string. Thank God that newspapers were nothing like today's, because if they were, we would probably have been able to read the news from our backsides. I came to love my home quite quickly, and the neighbours were our friends. When my mum wasn't home, I would go next door and they would give me my tea, even though sometimes it was only bread and dripping. Our yard was mostly unmade road, but it was also part cobblestone too. The undertakers, Robson and Ellis, a greengrocers, and Miss Pinders, who used to sell groceries as well as things like bread cakes, peas, potatoes and lamb chops. She also sold sweets such as Holland toffee and cherry lips and lots of other goodies. The owner of the shop was a lovely lady, and she was everyone's friend. Back in them days, because we were quite poor, we were able to buy our shopping on tick. Then we'd pay for it at the end of the week. The highlight of the week was my grandma's pension day, when she came to live with us. On that day we all got a full bag of chips with scraps on. We used to play in an old building at the bottom of the yard. We were told that there was passages to Kirkstall Abbey, but unfortunately it was just hearsay because none of us ever found them. On special occasions such as Carnival Day or anything that was to do with the King and Queen, we would decorate our yard, and we just had to pray that it wouldn't rain overnight. There would be tables set up and all of us would bring something, and then we would have a really nice yard party. Excuse me. Whenever anyone died, we would all close our curtains out of respect. There would be collections made, and despite how hard up everyone was, a few pennies were always found to buy a wreath. The first death I ever saw was a baby, and if any child wanted to see her laid out, they were allowed to do so. I went to look, and it was like looking at a sleeping baby doll. No one went to the chapel of rest when they died. Instead, they were laid out in a parlour, and people were allowed to go and pay their last respects. There was a ginnel down at the bottom of the yard which used to lead to Wakelands Lane. Then the yard went into a street which is where Nellie Lacey lived, who was a good friend of ours. Excuse me. When I was at town in school, I was allowed to take my little brother, who was about 3 years old at the time, until I moved to Bramley National. For a few years until we moved to Skipton, me and my family lived at number 21 Town End. When we moved back from Skipton, we lived at number 23 Town End Yard. Then we moved to an old detached house which was on Newcastle Place. These days that house would probably have been worth a fortune. Even though we were poor, we enjoyed life and we were happy, and we all had some really good friends. Excuse me. Eightlands Place, 1920 to 1935. At the bottom of Eightlands Lane, leading from Island Road, there was a small yard. On this yard there was 8 houses along with a potato warehouse. The warehouse used to belong to Arthur Lee and Sons. However, we called it Tatty Lee's. At the back of there was some spare land, just before you got to the long row of Eightlands Lane. All of us kids played on that land. Us boys played cricket and the girls played pies ball. On our side of the road there was about 5 houses, and the one we lived in was number 3. That house was a 2 up and 1 down, and to get in you would go through a small porch. There was a door on the left that used to go down into the cellars. Under the house there was one big cellar, and underneath the yard there was a smaller coal cellar. Because the cellars were really dark and there was no electricity, you had to light candles. When I was sent down to fetch a bucket of coal, excuse me, I was really scared. One of the jobs that I had to do was washing the cellar steps. Altogether there was about a dozen steps, and it got darker as I got closer to the bottom. I became more scared and I kept looking to the left and right. When I got to the bottom step, I gave it a quick slapdash, and then I got my bucket and ran up the stairs as though the devil was after me. We lived in a room that was quite large, with a floor that was made of stone flags, and 2 pieces of coconut matting that was used to carpet the floor. Every Sunday these were taken up for the wash day. Tuesday was always wash day, and on a Monday my mother always put our clothes into soak, and she would scrub towels as well as shirt collars ready to be washed on Tuesday. We used to have this big old-fashioned fireplace which had a big oven. We had a deep container which was at the opposite side, and we used it to keep the chips dry that we used for fire lighting. The cupboards were massive and they reached right up to the ceiling. Excuse me. There was the set pot that was used to boil clothes, and there was a stone shallow sink which only had one cold water tap. If we needed hot water, we had to boil it using the set pot, or we'd do it on the fire. There was this big cunninger that had wooden rollers. It also had a big handle that was really hard to turn. A man called Mr. Brooks owned the land behind the houses. This man had his own poultry farm. When he used to grow lettuces and cabbages, etc. The farm used to stretch right down to the Bramley steam laundry and towards the local Catholic school. Mr. Brooks had a path that went down the middle of his land, which also went over to the Withers, and some people would go over to Town Street to do their shopping. I can remember how Mr. Brooks always ploughed, using his horse. There was a guy who was called Percy, would come from Bramley every day, who was the hired help. We used to get a lovely lettuce which only cost 2 pence. We also used to get radishes that were so keen they would almost bite your tongue off. And if you wanted eggs, then you could get them. There was a big house down at the bottom of the yard, which had a green door in the wall. Behind the wall there was this huge garden with lawns that had flower beds round them. In one of the corners there was a summer house, and there was a big pear tree at the side. There was a hen run and a long stretch of garden which had row upon row of raspberry canes, along with some gooseberry bushes, all of which were behind another wall. When it was the school holidays, me and a friend of mine, Ruby, used to help a lady called Mrs. Thompson to pick some of the fruit, and for our tea she would give us both some raspberries. The toilets were based on the same side as the big house, and they were for the whole yard to use. We had to share the toilets with our neighbours, and everyone had to take it in turn to do the cleaning. There was a roof that we used to climb, which was on a low warehouse sort of building. On one end it was shallow, and on the other end it was high. When my mum came outside to call me in on a night time, I'd be there peeping at her over the roof. If she'd have caught me up there, she would have clattered me. As you went up 8 Lands Lane, you would see about 10 through houses that had small yards which were followed by a passage. Beyond the passage there was the start of a 3-storey block which partly formed Town End Yard and was a lot bigger than ours was. Because we were at the bottom of the yard, we were known as the lower yard, but if you lived at the top end of the yard, you were known as the top yard. In the late 60s, 8 Lands Place and the Town End Yard were both knocked down. Recollection of Mrs. Edmondson, née Elliot. Mrs. Edmondson's dad was Mr. Elliot, who owned a cycle shop which was based on Town Street. The back of it was in a yard called Ellis Yard. Before the cycle shop, Mr. Elliot had a shop which was at the top of Specht Yard, which later down the line became a Barker's, then Gillings, and then a Draper's. It was said that he'd travelled around every county here in England, and that he'd cycled to John O'Groats from Land's End. Lots of people would ask him which were the best routes to take to get to different places around the country. This included bikers removal people who used to also run charabanc trips. She would also recall that the whole family had their own jobs to do around the house and would go shopping every week. The job she had to do was clean the shop once a week on a Thursday when she came home from school. There was lots of parts, bikes and tricycles around the place, so it wasn't an easy job for her to do. There was one funny incident that she said was quite funny. Her dad had won an umbrella in a cycling race, and it was something that he was very proud of. He'd been on a visit to Sugden's blacksmiths, and he left the umbrella there. For months he blamed his wife for its disappearance. Then when he went on another visit to the same blacksmiths, he found it, and it was all rusty and it fell apart when he opened it. After that day, whenever anything went missing, the family would say, "I bet it's at Sugden's smithies." Mrs. Elliot used to be a really good cook, and she used to bake quite often. There was an old lady called Mrs. Stead who lived near the Elliott's shop, and Mrs. Elliott would send her some of her baking. Mrs. Stead told everyone one day that she had everything laid out for when she passed away and needed laying out except for a white pair of stockings, so Mrs. Elliott gave her a pair. The caretaker of the Good Shepherd School at Town End was Mr. Elliott, and he had been for 30 years. Mrs. Edmondson always helped him to wash the floors and to wash up after there'd been parties and dances. Turner's Yard. The entrance to Turner's Yard wasn't far away from the bottom of Stocks Hill, which was right in the middle of Old Bramley before it was redeveloped. There was a wool shop which was in the corner, and the side window looked out onto Turner's Yard. Next to this there was the entrance to White's Bakehouse. There was a steep rocky road that you had to walk up to get to the cottages behind, and in wet and icy weather it was quite a problem. Beyond this the road was levelled out, and there was around 3 or 4 cottages there. The cottages were quite pleasant looking. They all looked out towards the church, and at the front of each one there was a grassed area which had plenty of room for people to hang their washing out. As you came back down the yard there was 2 modern looking houses. One of them was double fronted, and there was quite a lot of steps leading to the front door. There was an old lady called Mrs. Robinson who lived there, but she was very lame and she couldn't go out. The house would most likely have had a lovely view which would have looked down Outgang and beyond. There was another house on the left of Mrs. Robinson's house. This house had been built around the same time as Mrs. Robinson's, and a man called Mr. Hughes lived there. Mr. Hughes was a retired plumber, and his son took on the business that was next door. It was in a house that looked like it was sandwiched in a small place near the living quarters and the back doors of Williamson's, which was a greengrocer's, and Busfield's, which was a butcher's. One day Mr. Hughes the plumber died very suddenly, which meant that was the end of another small family firm. His wife, who was known by everyone as Vi, would be seen in and around the shops, and she was always willing to talk to people and tell them the local news. End of part 2. Thank you guys. Thanks for watching. Love you. Bye.